Hi again, everyone. This is Pastor Reggie from First Lutheran Church in Aitkin, and it's time for another Bible study, looking at the text for this coming Sunday. Actually, for this Sunday, it's a text that would have been the assigned lectionary text for this Sunday. We are doing creation care this Sunday, so there's a special readings. But I thought we would still take some time to look at the assigned text for this week because it's one of those super familiar stories. It's the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. You all know it very well. But there's some things in there that you may not have noticed before, so I'd like to point those out for us today. Now, first of all, things to note about this story. First of all, it's the third Sunday of Easter, and you would naturally think that would mean that in the gospel we must be 2 weeks after the resurrection. But actually, we are still talking about an event that happened on the day of resurrection. Now, our reading is from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 35, which is a little surprising. We are in year A, the year of Matthew. And so throughout the season of Pentecost, um, all 28 weeks of that, those are all readings from the Gospel of Matthew. During the season of Easter, in all 3 years of the lectionary, the Gospel readings are all from the Gospel of John, except from this one Sunday. And so, this third Sunday of Easter, we have a reading from the Gospel of Luke. And we have to ask ourselves now why? Why is this interrupting a John series in the middle of a Matthew year? Well, there's something special about this reading from Luke. So let's go ahead and read it and see what it has to say. Luke 24:13 to 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. After talking with each other about all these things that had happened, while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, What were you discussing with each other while you walk along? They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? He asked them, What things? They replied, The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who had said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it, just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. All right. And so, why is it that this appears in a Matthew year? Well, on the second Sunday of Easter every year, we have the story of doubting Thomas. On the fourth Sunday every year, we have a reading from the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John about the Good Shepherd. Those are the themes for these first weeks. The third Sunday in Easter, there's always a reading about Jesus eating with the disciples after the resurrection. All 3 years, a story about eating with the disciples. And there's a reason for that. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today. So it begins with Jesus appearing to them, and their eyes were kept from seeing Jesus, from recognizing him. What was it? Who or what kept them from recognizing Jesus? This week, the Luther Seminary God Pause devotion told an interesting little bit about this. So I'm going to read this for you. Traveling from Washington State to South Dakota, we took a route through North Dakota. Near Medora, we stopped. As we looked around a visitor center, a man came up and said, "Hi, Gary, what are you doing here?" Who was this guy? No idea. He must have noticed my bewilderment because he said, "Jim, your cousin." Of course it was, but I did not recognize him because he should not have been there. He lives in Rugby, not Medora. We live in South Dakota. What are the odds? Same place, same day, same time? He should not have been there. And so these disciples don't recognize Jesus because to their mind, he should not have been there. All the verbs in this story, when they're talking about we had hoped. We thought he was a prophet. It's all past tense. They think the story's over. They don't expect to see Jesus there. And so their expectations get in the way. Our expectations blind us to the real Jesus too. We don't see Jesus when he appears in our lives because we don't expect to see him doing something in our lives. Our narrow understandings about who God actually is, what God would do, where would God go, prevent us from seeing God doing things in this world. You know, it's these two anonymous. One of them is named Cleopas, but we never hear from him again in the Bible. It's 3 days later. They've been in Jerusalem, and 3 days later, they're going back to their home. What do you think they were there for? They were disciples of Jesus. Is it possible that they were still in Jerusalem these 3 days because they were there for his funeral? Remember, that's what happened with Lazarus. There was a traditional amount of time before there was a burial, before there was a funeral, and so maybe they were there for the funeral, and they're just talking about who Jesus was, his story, all the things that he had done, not what they thought that he would do. Even though they had heard stories, they didn't believe those stories. And so we have a problem here because one of the things that they say is that we had hoped that he would bring the redemption of Israel. Redemption is a problem. Jews say things like, if it is true that the Messiah of which our ancient prophets spoke has already come, How then do you explain the present state of the world? The world doesn't look redeemed. There is still a lot wrong with this world. So how can we say that the Redeemer has come? Well, Jesus points to something else. And he says, was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? He's telling them that the redemption of Israel, not just Israel, the redemption of the world depended on the suffering. And that's something that they hadn't thought about at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite of what they had expected. And it's quite the opposite of what we expect too. Or do we expect to see God in places of suffering, in places of heartbreak and hurt and grief? We have a God that surprises us. It shows up in places we don't expect, does things we don't expect. We have a God that shows up in the opposite, honestly, the opposite of what we expect. We have a God of irony. And so our expectations get in the way. I think we still have a problem with redemption. We struggle with seeing things in this world and thinking, how can God allow this to happen? How can we say that we have an active God when we see these awful things happen? You know, we'll still have challenges in this world, challenges to our faith and our hope. We will not be victorious over every obstacle in our lives, in spite of what those prosperity preachers out there will teach you. There are times when the world gives you too much, and then you can't bear this loss. There will be something that you cannot recover from. There will be something that you will die from. But for us as Christians, death is the gate to eternal life. I know of a pastor who had a congregation that was praying for a 15-year-old boy with cancer. And the cure rate for his type of cancer was 75%. And the prayer chain and many others in the church had been praying for him for months. And they all expected the prayers and the treatments to work so that this young man might live a happy and normal life again. But he didn't. The prayers changed to asking that the upcoming death would not be painful. Isn't that part of the tension between divine action and our human expectations? How can we understand God working in the world when the world is suffering and full of death? The death of Jesus. And it's even harder when that suffering involves the death of children and the innocent. Right now, we're facing this coronavirus pandemic. Millions around the world are getting sick. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying. But it's just a tiny, unseen virus. It's wreaking havoc throughout our world. And it's causing an economic collapse. How can we see God working even in the midst of all of this? How do we keep hope alive when peace and health and prosperity seem to be impossible right now? What does our faith in Jesus mean in a time such as this? In the midst of our grieving and our hopelessness, it can still be difficult to recognize the risen Jesus in our midst. It can still be difficult to understand the scriptures properly. But Jesus didn't give up on those disciples. He says they're foolish and slow of heart to believe, but he didn't give up on them. He taught them. He was present with them. He walked with them and showed them the truth. Isn't that what God does for us now? Walks with us in the midst of our pain, of our hopelessness, our uncertainty. When we feel lost, God is present with us and walks with us. What's interesting is last week we saw in the Gospel of John how it really stresses that faith comes by hearing. And these disciples heard the word interpreted to them. And when they look back on it later, they say, "Weren't our hearts burning within us?" But they still didn't recognize Jesus. Something more is needed. And so Jesus does something more. Sometimes in the Bible, the structure of a reading, there's some genius to how the Bible writers write things. And in this story, there's something called a chiasm. A chiasm is like a bracket. So it says one thing and another thing and another thing, and then the reverse of that thing, and then the reverse of the second thing, and then the reverse of that first thing. And so it points to something in the middle. And what is Jesus pointing to in the middle? Well, it starts with the two departing from Jerusalem. And then the next thing is Jesus comes to them. And the third thing in the middle is they don't recognize Jesus. Then the reverse happens. They do recognize Jesus. And then Jesus disappears. And then they return to Jerusalem. And so since they're pointing in the middle, it's pointing to the recognizing Jesus. That's the point that the writer wants you to see. Recognizing Jesus. And how do they recognize Jesus? It's when he does something unusual. He's the guest at their home, and he takes the bread and feeds them. That's not something that a guest usually does, but he has a purpose there, because the phrasing there. He takes the bread and he blesses it and he gives it to them. That's the same pattern that we have at the Last Supper. The same pattern as the feeding of the 5,000. This is a pattern of communion. And it's in this breaking of the bread that they recognize Jesus. The feeding event, when Jesus feeds them, that's when their eyes are opened and they can really see Jesus for who he really is. Sometimes we need more than Jesus being present and more than just the word. Sometimes we also need to be fed. And that's why communion is so important for us as Christians, why we miss it so much right now when we can't gather as a community. We need to be fed so we can see Jesus active in our lives and in this world. But when their eyes are opened, Jesus has done what he came to do. He disappears from them. And they rush back to Jerusalem. Now remember, it's already dark. That's why they asked Jesus to stay with them. But they don't care. They don't care that the road is dangerous. They go anyway. They rush back to see the disciples. And you see the contrast there. How slow and mournful that walk to Emmaus would have been, and how joyful that run back to Jerusalem would have been. The same journey, but with a completely different mindset. How much faster that journey would have gone. Hope makes all the difference. Having had their eyes opened, having seen Jesus, having had him walk with them, having been fed, hope changes everything. As always, there's so much more we could say about this, but that's enough for today. And I hope this has been a helpful Bible study for all of you, and I hope you'll attend online our worship service this Sunday. Again, would have been the assigned text. This Sunday is Creation Sunday because of Earth Day being this week. God bless all of you, and happy Easter.